Hey everybody. So this is going to be the third video in my series of talking about the various polar functions and how you see domain shifting happen with each particular type of polar function. If you haven't already, you might want to watch the first video I did, which is the TE polar video, where I give a little bit more background about what I mean by domain shifting from one function area to another function, and give a few examples in the TE context. However, if you just want to watch this, the general idea here is that everybody has a polar function, which is going to be your seventh function out of your 8-function stack. And the best way to think about it, or to figure out what your polar function is going to be, is figure out what your third function is, and then it's the opposite of whatever that is. So if you're an INFJ and your third function is introverted thinking, then your polar function is going to be extroverted thinking. And the polar function, or point of least resistance, is a function that people will describe as the blind spot, or the spot that really takes, that people, not only do they ignore it, but it's almost like there's not even conscious that it's there unless they really have to spend a lot of attention on it. And then that's just going to take a lot of mental energy and a lot of mental resources. So my argument here is that if somebody's presented with an issue or a problem, in their polar domain, they're going to try to shift the issue or the problem into their second function, which is their tool function, or the domain of their second function. So with this one, I'm going to be talking about TI polar. So we're talking about the ESFPs and the ENFPs, where their tool function is going to be introverted feeling, and then their polar function is going to be introverted thinking. Okay, so the argument being, if they're presented with a TI problem or a TI issue, where people who aren't TI polar are going to use TI, to address the issue, they tend to shift it into more of an FI type of issue, or try to shift it into the FI domain. I'm going to give you a little bit of warning, because to me the best way to describe this phenomenon is in the world of politics. And so I'm going to be talking about a few political issues, but I'm not taking any particular side or arguing any particular side. So I'm definitely not trying to make this into a political type of video. However, it does come up a lot in politics, and it's sort of it's an easy example to use and easy to see there. The other thing I want to point out is that to say somebody's TI polar is, in a lot of ways almost insulting, because it's, kind of making the argument that, if TI deals with internal logic and symbolic logic, that, they are somehow illogical or not able to use logic. And I don't really want to come across as saying that. But what I do think ends up happening is you take an issue where people are trying to solve it logically, and they will add sort of an ethical dimension to it. So I hope I don't come across as saying ENFPs and ESFPs are illogical or anything derogatory like that. I think they just look at particular issues or subject matters in a very different domain, and in a lot of times they end up being right. Where somebody might be overly logically thinking of the issue, and then they're just sort of wrong, in their key assumptions, or what they're sort of plugging into their logic machine, and the ESFPs and the ENFPs are really the people who tend to put that into check and sort of point it out. Not that that there's necessarily a logical fallacy, but just that sort of the key assumptions going into it were wrong. So, just a little bit of preface that I'm not trying to bag on ESFPs or ENFPs by any stretch. In fact, I think, some of this domain shifting actually ends up being advantageous in a lot of ways. Okay, so let's talk about some examples. So if somebody's TI polar, they're going to be ignoring what I'll refer to as arguments that have a conclusion where it's necessarily the case, right? So if you make some sort of logical argument and you're following your formal logical formulas, formal logic, right? If P, then Q, then if you have a condition where P exists, then logically and necessarily speaking, then Q, right? So, example I always use is, all poodles are dogs, and if Barney is a poodle, then it's necessarily the case that Barney is a dog, okay? And so that's introverted thinking, that's introverted logic at its very basic, simplest form. So somebody who's TI polar is going to sort of ignore or avoid or really sort of doubt. They're very skeptical in this sense. They doubt any sort of argument where something is necessarily the case, right? Because in the FI domain, it's dealing not so much with symbolic logic where things are either valid or invalid or true or not true, but it's more of a dynamic, right? It's more of a cost-benefit analysis, where you're dealing with the values of things. Is this thing beneficial to me? And not only is it beneficial to me, but how many resources do I need to put into to obtain this thing, right? So things might be beneficial, like everybody could get a Lamborghini if they wanted, but you're gonna have to put in a lot of cost, right, or a lot of energy to get the Lamborghini. And so the value of a Lamborghini might be different for different people depending on how much energy or how much cost they have to put into it. And so people who are using FI are, thinking about the world in those terms, cost benefit analysis, and not so much of if P then Q type of analysis. And so you're going to see this a lot in a lot of different types of arguments that just pop up on the TV, things that people like to get into, different arguments. So, especially political or economic arguments, right? So let's just take a, sort of a core problem and then look at the different ways that the functions would sort of treat it. So, poverty in the United States, right? There's a certain percentage of people who live below the poverty line for one reason or another, and somebody wants to come up with sort of a political solution to the problem. And one solution could be, let's just give everybody who's below the poverty line, or just everybody, $2,000, right, to help them pay for their bills or help them, buy more food or whatever. We're just going to give them $2,000 a month or whatever. And the TI approach to that is, okay, that might help in the short term, but in the long term, what you're going to see is prices rising, right? If you give everybody, this is the classic throwing money out of the helicopter problem, right? If you just throw money out of the helicopter and just give everybody an extra $2,000. Well, now everybody has $2,000 more of buying power, and assuming they don't use it to pay off debt, that's a different thing. But now they've got this money that they could go out and buy things with, and so you're going to see an increase in demand. You're going to see more people chasing after fewer goods because they've got money to do it. And so now the people who are selling the goods are running into sort of a scarcity issue, and so they have to raise prices, right? And so what you're going to see, just sort of a sort of logical argument where it's just if P then Q, and it's necessarily the case, right? If you give everybody $2,000, then you're just going to see prices naturally increase, and you see it all the time, right? I mean, during the COVID pandemic, they gave everybody, their COVID stimulus money, or at least a lot of people, and it was enough to sort of drive prices up in the economy. And so now you're seeing, inflation because you have, more dollars chasing after the same number of goods, and so it just raises the prices until everybody can sort of stabilize. And so the TI users are going to make this logical argument that it's necessarily the case that if you just give everybody money, people are not going to end up better off, and if anything, they might end up worse off. Same thing. Well, let me go. But if you present it to like an ENFP or an ESFP, where they're sort of ignoring that logic function, that TI function, they're going to domain shift that into more of an FI type analysis, right? Where they're going to look at it more from the ethical perspective and more from sort of the cost benefit perspective for society at whole, right? And so they might make arguments like, well, first of all, the ESFP and the ENFP are sort of notorious for saying things like, well, that's just your opinion, right? So you can lay out this nice logical argument that, look, if you increase the money supply, then prices are just automatically going to go up. And it's just a fundamental rule of the universe. It's a fundamental rule of economics. And you'll get a lot of pushback from the ESFPs and the ENFPs saying, well, that's just your opinion, right? Because in their mind, arguments are opinions. Arguments are, what's the cost, what's the benefit? And everybody has an opinion of, what the value of something is. And so you'll see pushback where they might move it more into the ethical domain. First of all, they'll just sort of attack the logical argument and say, this is just, that person's way of trying to, keep people below the poverty line because they benefit from it for some reason, right? And they're just coming up with this argument and trying to say that it's, necessarily the case, it's logically true in all situations. And, but really what they're trying to do is just sort of protect the status quo and not spend the money to, help these people that are under the poverty line. So that's sort of the first argument, right? And then you'll see other arguments where, let's say they do it. They actually send out the stimulus checks like they did with COVID, and you'll see the prices start rising. And then the argument isn't, well, that's just what you expect when you increase the money supply. It's, well, there's all these greedy corporations out there and they're price gouging everybody. They're just sort of taking advantage of the fact that people have more money, and so they're increasing their prices. And that might be true, right? I'm not trying to say whether it's true or not. But as you'll see, they sort of shifted the issue from a very sort of mechanical, logical, mathematical formula, increases to the money supply, in all times lead to an increase to inflation, to more of an ethical issue of you've just got the people in charge, or the companies who are selling everything, raising their prices, right? And so they've shifted it, again, from a TI argument into an FI argument. So this happens in politics all the time, and you could think of, in economics, you could think of other situations like, rent control, where, the because of sort of a free market system, you're seeing popular areas, the rent in popular areas just skyrocket, right? They're going from $1,000 to a month to 2,000 to 3,000, and they're just skyrocketing. And again, the TI user is going to be like, well, that's just sort of a natural evolution of, if you want people to invest in their property and to, add in the latest and greatest Wi-Fi capabilities and connectivity and the latest and greatest, granite counters and washing machines and, dishwashers and all the kind of stuff that 20, 30 years ago, a lot of people would live without. And now, it's just sort of seen as like a bare minimum that you need. Well, okay, landowners or apartment owners are going to invest and they're going to put that in. And so you're just going to see prices rise over time. Not only that, but, property taxes go up, inflation just in general goes up. And so you're going to see apartment prices rising, and sometimes, very dramatically, especially if it's a high demand area where you have, more people looking for apartments than there are apartments available. So, but the FI approach to the problem might be, well, let's just put in rent controls, right? Let's tell all the property owners that you gotta stick with your current property, your current rent price, and you can only increase it by like 5% every year or something like that. And if you increase it any more, or you have to keep it the same or whatever, then we're gonna, fine you or whatever. Okay, so what you see happening is, if the property owners can't increase their prices, they're just gonna ignore the property, right? They're not gonna do repairs as often. They're not going to do improvements. They're not going to install the Wi-Fi stuff or the new dishwasher and all that kind of stuff because they're not getting any return on it, right? And so then what you see happening is, the living conditions for people who are living in these rent-controlled apartments just get worse and worse and worse unless they're going to, personally invest their own money into improving it. And so, the buildings get in worse conditions. The functional use of, the refrigerator's always out, the toilet's always out, just things like that, because the owner has no incentive to replace things or repair things or improve them. So again, people end up worse off, but the FI counter argument, of course, is, well, that has nothing to do with the rent controls. That has to do with the greedy owners. And what we need to do is put in more laws that require them to update their refrigerators and update their repairs and keep everything up to code, so on and so forth. And then it just becomes sort of this untenable problem. And again, the FI reaction is, let's make this more into an ethical problem as opposed to just sort of a money, dollars and cents logic problem, right? And again, I do want to point out that sometimes the FI users are right? Sometimes the ENFP and the ESFP who might be ignoring the TI logical argument behind everything, they might, like their solution might actually be the better solution for one reason or another. Again, I'm not here to sort of say who's right or who's wrong. I'm just here to point out the general phenomenon that, especially in the political domain, where you have a certain contingent of people who just want to make the rational, logical argument, if this, then that. And this is always necessarily the case. Versus the FI people who want to make more of a cost-benefit, value-based argument and shift it into that domain, and again they'll sort of make the argument that, well, that's just your opinion, or there's some sort of ethical reason why you're doing that or not doing it, and we need to think about the ethics more than we need to think about sort of the underlying logic. And if it creates other problems, then we'll just deal with the other problems in the same way, in an ethical, value-based kind of way, right? So if rent controls mean that the owners aren't investing the money appropriately into keeping things up to keeping repairs up and all that, and the buildings start dilapidating, then we'll just put in more laws that require them to spend the money to do that, right? So that's sort of the domain shifting to the FI. Another example I like to use is, if you've got somebody who's an ESFP or an ENFP and you want to see an example of this, just try talking to them about Bitcoin, right? Like if you're into Bitcoin and sort of the logical advantage of getting into Bitcoin and investing in Bitcoin, just watch an ESFP or an ENFP react to that, because you can lay down the logical argument of why Bitcoin is, a sound investment and, probably a better investment than most asset classes, over time, over the long run, how it's going to perform better. When you give those sort of arguments to an ESFP or an ENFP, again, a lot of the times the feedback is just like they just don't believe the logic behind it. They just don't believe that it's necessarily the case that something's gonna turn out as the better investment. It's a lot of like, well, what if they're wrong, or that's just their opinion, as opposed to, arguing it on sort of the logical merits of, why the condition might be wrong or why it's not a valid argument. It's more of just, well, that's just their opinion. That's just the crazy crypto people out there, and then of course you'll see FTX collapse or some other coin collapse in price, or Bitcoin will collapse in price, and the heavy FI users are going to be like, see, I told you you were wrong. And you're like, okay, yeah, but I'm really talking about in the 10-year, 20-year term, but okay. I get it. So again, they can be sort of a good check on relying too much on just sort of a rational, logical argument and sort of picking out, what the ethical problems can be, right? Like if we just, as a society, just operated purely on pure logic and pure rational thinking, the introverted thinking type, then, that might lead to a bunch of ethical quandaries that, that we weren't really taking into account, right? And it might make people worse off than they otherwise would have been. And so, so there is a benefit to it. Another example, with the Bitcoin example, I always make the argument that I think Joe Rogan is probably an ESFP. And the reason that I say that is because every time there's sort of an introverted thinking argument where somebody's just sort of trying to lay out a rational case for some sort of argument, if P then Q, we have condition P, therefore we have condition Q, or we don't have condition Q, therefore we don't have condition P, that kind of stuff. You'll see him sort of, it's not that he's just like completely dismissive, but a lot of it is just like, well, that's their opinion, right? That, those Bitcoin people, that's their opinion and they're certainly entitled to it, but I just don't share that opinion. And he's looking at it at this sort of cost benefit analysis. Like, there's no way I'm putting my hundreds of millions of dollars into that because I just don't see the benefit of it, and you can argue to me all day until you're red in the face about the logic behind it. But I'm doing a cost benefit analysis of it and I just don't see it. Right. And, it might work for everybody else, and that's cool if everybody else wants to do it, but I'm just not seeing it. And you'll see it also in a lot of other sort of guests who are, obviously like INTPs or ISTPs and have a very strong TI, and they're sort of making their little TI argument for something. And, and he'll sort of pop in and be like, well, that's just sort of your opinion, right? That's not necessarily the case, right? There's other experts out there that, would argue otherwise, or, are you thinking about all the people that you're sort of leaving out here, that kind of thing. And again, he'll sort of take their argument and shift it into a FI, ethical cost benefit type of argument. Now, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if he's necessarily an ESFP or not. I think he is, and it just sort of makes me chuckle every time I see him sort of doing this domain shifting, going from a TI conversation and shifting it into an FI conversation, because that's just sort of more natural to him. And again, I'm not trying to say that, he's illogical and doesn't have logic or anything, but what he's going to do is he's going to look at the cost benefit, the ethical argument, and give more weight to that than he is to just a pure TI type of argument. You also see it a lot in the entertainment world. You got a lot of ESFPs in the entertainment world. Just like you have a lot of ENFPs in the political world, you have a lot of ESFPs in the entertainment world. And so, somebody like, let's just, they'll start making these sort of arguments about how they're getting screwed over by the record labels or, the movie studios or something, and not in the literal like Harvey Weinstein sense, but in the like they got into a contract and they don't like the contract, and it's like personally an affront to their FI, right? Like, I don't know, maybe Dave Chappelle might be a good example, or Kanye West, where, they sort of got into these like notorious contract battles with, the various studios. And again, the studio, with all their lawyers and everything, they're going to have a very TI backed argument. Like, look, we can't just give everybody X amount of money, $50 million or $100 million or whatever, because if we did that for everybody, then we would lose money. And you have to understand that like only 20% of the bands that we sign or the shows that we put on air are ever going to make money. The other 80% are losers. And so, so for those 20% who make money, you have to understand, the only reason you made money in the first place is because, of our backing. That's their argument, right? The record label or the TV studio or whatever. And we, so thank you, we appreciate the fact that you're making us money, but we have to use a lot of that money to cover all of the other expenses for the projects that didn't work out. Now, if you're Kanye West or Dave Chappelle, and again, I'd probably argue they're probably ENFPs or ESFPs, but that's beside the point. If they're, they're going to shift that TI argument into an FI argument, right? They're just going to be like, well, that's just ethically wrong, right? Like, you're screwing me out of my money because you can't make a good business decision, right? Because you can't hit 100% every time. You're gonna take money, from me, or you're going to screw me on this deal or whatever. And again, I'm not saying who's right or wrong. Like Kanye West and Dave Chappelle probably have very good arguments that they definitely did get screwed over. But again, they're taking a very TI economics negotiation over their contract or their deal and shifting it into the FI domain. What's the benefit to me? What's the cost to me? What's the value of this to me? And in the very famous case of Dave Chappelle, he just walked away and was like, well, screw you, I'm not dealing with this, right? And very FI reaction, right, to the problem. And so instead of using sort of a TI argument, he'll use the FI argument. And you see it every time he talks about it. Same with Kanye, same with Prince. And so, again, in no way trying to say that they're being illogical in the way that they're dealing with these problems, but what they're doing is they're shifting it from a very just rational dollars and cents type of argument, which of course the studio, like all the accountants and all the bean counters and all the lawyers and all upper level management at the studios and the record labels, they all look at this as a very TI problem, right? Or a TI issue, right? We're talking dollars and cents, and there's only so many dollars and so many cents that we can make, and so we have to be very rational with the way we're doing it, where the big stars, Dave Chappelle, Kanye West, Prince, and everything are like, look, I don't care about your TI arguments here. I care about what's happening to me and whether or not, I feel like you're violating my ethics here. And again, I think this is a good way in which the FI tool users sort of keep the TI tool users and TI users in check, right? Like you can't have a rational argument for everything. Sometimes you have to take the ethics into account. And they certainly do that, right? They will certainly shift your TI argument into an FI argument. So for those of you who are dealing with ESFPs or ENFPs, you have to keep that in mind, that if you're trying to make just sort of a TI, if P, then Q type of argument with them, especially if you guys don't see things eye to eye, or you're negotiating or have a conflict, they are most likely going to shift it into an FI argument. And so the way to win any sort of argument, or at least to find some common ground and negotiate, find a mutually beneficial type of arrangement, is to meet them on those FI grounds, right? And to discuss, to see the problem in an FI way. And hopefully you're not FI polar, because that's when you see the biggest breakdown, when you have the FI polars dealing with the TI polars. They're just not going to find that mutual way of looking at it, or that mutual ground. So get the ENTPs out of the room, get the ESTPs out of the room, anybody who is going to be FI polar, and try to, talk to them on the FI wavelength or the FI domain. And you saw Netflix do this, right? I mean, they came in and met Dave Chappelle on that FI grounds. They're like, look, we get it. Like, this is your stuff. There was a famous example where they put out his old show on Netflix, and Chappelle wasn't getting any of the residuals from whenever Netflix would stream it, or if he was getting a very small amount. And so he goes to Netflix. He's like, look, this is an ethical issue. This is an FI personal problem for me. I don't like it. And so Netflix was like, fine, instead of trying to dollar and cents them, and instead of trying to say, okay, we'll give you $50 million to just go away and shut up, they were like, fine, we'll take it off. We appreciate our relationship with you, and we understand where you're coming from on an FI, ethical cost benefit wavelength or domain. And of course, rationally speaking, Netflix probably ended up way better off on the TI part of it too, by listening to the FI people and, coming up with a nice FI solution. Because eventually that all got, figured out, and Chappelle started getting royalties from the people who owned the Chappelle Show, or at least they gave him ownership to some extent. And so it all worked out, But if everybody just sort of dug in their heels and treated it like a TI problem and completely ignoring the FI part of it, I seriously doubt anything would have happened, and that's when you see these FI tool users like the ESFPs and the ENFPs arguing about, look, we're getting screwed by, the big corporations or the lawyers or the accountants or, the management types. It's because you're seeing this TI versus FI battle where the lawyers and the accountants and the management types are taking a very TI approach, a very, what's the bottom line here? If we spend this money and all that, to something that the other guy, the entertainer, see as an FI problem. Okay. You see it in the sports world. Again, you get a lot of ESFPs, probably a lot of ENFPs in the sports world. Really anywhere where you see sort of the performers, in conflict with the management types, right? It's probably going to be a TI versus FI problem. And it's not because Dave Chappelle or Kanye West or Joe Rogan or whoever has FI as a dominant function. It's because it's in their tool function. It's like that's how they solve problems. They solve problems using their FI, using, what's the ethical solution. And a lot of times it's what's best for me in this, but they'll also look at the larger, global picture. What's the ethical solution? But how is this affecting me? How is this, what's the cost benefit breakdown for me, as opposed to just listening to, upper level management, lawyers, accountants that are going to give them a very TI logical solution or explanation of, why they should take less money, that kind of thing. Okay, so I think that's about it. Feel free to give me any comments, questions down below. Happy to engage, and I'll see you on the next video. Thanks. Bye.